Welcome to part 10 of the Great Depression and the New Deal. Now we're going to talk about other opponents to the New Deal besides Huey Long. Now, certainly Huey Long was the most powerful of the opponents to the New Deal and FDR because he had political power and lots of it. But other people were opposed to it as well. People like Father Charles Coughlin. Father Charles Coughlin was a Catholic priest, but he also had a radio show. He was a radio preacher. He had a show on CBS called The Hour of Power. Had over 16 million listeners, right? Now, initially, Coughlin had been a supporter of FDR. But Coughlin had also called for the nationalization of the American banking system, right, as a way to fix the banks. Roosevelt was adamantly against this, as he would put it that nationalizing the banking system was the equivalent of socialism, right? One of the things that is true about FDR that some critics of him claim, one thing is that he's not in favor of socialism. Some critics claim that he was trying to bring socialism to the United States. That's not what FDR was trying to do. He was trying to save capitalism. This is why when you look at the projects, like the different little projects that get people working, that you notice that they're jobs. They're not just handouts. They're not just cutting checks for the most part. I know the Agricultural Adjustment Act might be an exception, but you're putting the people to work. He said you have to have Americans work because they have this American pride, right? They just don't want a handout. Okay, that was his argument. And socialism certainly would call for things like that. So when Roosevelt rejects this idea of nationalizing the banks, Charles Coughlin turns on him and begins to very vocally and adamantly criticize Roosevelt in his weekly sermons, right? Now, that's about as far as this goes. Coughlin, like I said, he doesn't wield any real political power. He has no political aspirations. And even if he did, it probably wouldn't get very far because Charles Coughlin is also a raging anti-Semite, right? You also hear him often rail against Jews in his sermons as well. Now, another critic of Roosevelt and the New Deal was a Dr. Francis Townsend. Dr. Francis Townsend, though, is just going to come up with a different idea. What had happened with Dr. Townsend is that one time he was eating breakfast there, and he noticed 3 elderly women digging through his trash, looking out his window, and it got him to thinking, what happens to the elderly during these times? You see, this is a time period, there's no retirement plans in companies and things like that. There's no 401ks. And typically the way things work, that if you reached retirement age or you reached an age where you can no longer work, well, your family would take care of you. And that is typically what was done. But what happens if you don't have a family to take care of you? Well, then you're left on the street. All right. So Dr. Francis Townsend comes up with a plan, the Townsend Plan. And what this calls for is it calls for that everyone over the age of 60 should be given $200 a month. Right? He's going to form these Townsend clubs that are going to spring up all over America. He's going to have a membership of, by 1936, of over 100,000 people, right? That's going to call for this. $200 a month paycheck. The only caveat is that you have to spend all 200 bucks. You can't squirrel it away, you know. And so the only thing the Townsend Plan doesn't do is it doesn't provide for an avenue of how are you going to come up with the $200? How are you going to actually pay for it? So it is a good plan, it is a good idea, but it's not one that really has a plan for funding it. But that's okay, because what's going to happen here is Roosevelt is going to take this plan that Dr. Townsend comes up with, modify it, and it's going to become a New Deal program called the Social Security Act, which creates the Social Security Administration. So by 1935, you start to see a movement towards reform, more and more reform inside the New Deal programs, right? Remember, reform is trying to create programs that are going to keep another depression from ever coming. Now, as I mentioned before, some of these programs that Roosevelt had come up with had been shot down, and so he brings some of them back. Like, for example, the Wagner Act of 1935 is designed to help bring back that portion of the National Recovery Administration, which guaranteed the ability of collective bargaining and the right to unionize in the United States, right? It's going to create the National Labor Relations Board, right? You're going to have the National Labor Relations Board is going to be responsible for ensuring that companies allow unions to form and that they're allowed to negotiate in good faith, things like that, right? In 1938, you're going to have the Fair Labor Standards Act passed. This is going to bring back some of the things like the minimum wage and the maximum hours and the guaranteed overtime, things that also disappeared with the Supreme Court overruling the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, right? And then, of course, the aforementioned Social Security Act, which is going to be the Townsend Act, except it's going to be modified. First of all, you had to be 65. It's not going to be $200 a month. It's going to be less than that. But there is a plan for paying for it. There's going to be payroll taxes taken out. Social Security is taken out of everybody's payroll, deducted from their payroll, and so that's going to be used to pay for the act. And back then, this made a lot of sense because there were basically 4 to 5 people working for every person of retirement age. It's a little bit different than that today, but Social Security is still around. And I know that when I was a kid, I was told it would be gone by the time I was old enough to collect it. My father was also told the same thing, and it's turned out to not be true in any of these cases.